Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a place that looks dazzling from a distance but hides something far stranger, far more human, and quietly horrifying beneath its polished surface, and if you lean in too close. Because the smell of this story is strong enough to haunt an entire 16th century kingdom. So now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself standing inside a great hall glowing with gold, candles flickering against walls painted with royal emblems, velvet-draped figures drifting past like silent shadows. Yet the very first thing that shatters this beauty is not a sound, not a sight, but a smell. Not one smell, but a collision of everything the late medieval world tried desperately to hide: human waste, dumped straight from upper windows, rotting garbage piled outside the stone walls, dead rats decaying under loose floorboards, black clouds of flies circling corners where water never dries. This is the real Europe of the 16th century, a world without bathrooms, without soap, without deodorant, where opening a window is like holding your face over the open wound of a civilization still crawling out of the Dark Ages. And right in the center of that chaos stands a woman who not only ruled a kingdom, but decided she would do what no monarch before her dared. She would make scent into law, turn fragrance into social hierarchy, and transform herself into the living symbol of purity in a world that smelled like death. When Elizabeth I, the sharp-minded, iron-willed queen who guided her small island nation into global prominence, ascended the throne, she stepped into a palace that was anything but the shimmering fairy tale we imagine today. It was a magnificent silver cup with a foul odor rising from the inside, and her deep, unspoken fear rose with it. In response, she issued a decree so cold and so absolute, it carried more weight than any sword. Anyone whose scent displeased the queen would be forbidden from entering the palace. No exceptions, no explanations, no second chances. The pathway to power, fortune, and royal favor suddenly depended on something invisible: the smell of your body. People now laugh at this law as if it were a dark little joke about royalty. But in the 16th century, smell was survival. Plague traveled with stench, death announced itself through sour air, and filth settled on every wall like a reminder that the world had not yet learned how to keep itself alive. Elizabeth's fear was not a whim. It was carved from the memory of a childhood surrounded by sickness, rot, and the kind of odors that came before funerals. She could not bear the idea that foul scent meant danger, decay, or a threat to her own safety. And so the palace adapted. Courtiers, diplomats, and noble visitors became walking perfume flasks, rubbing themselves with rosewater, soaking gloves in essential oils, dusting hair with fragrant powders, steeping cloaks in herbal wine overnight, and praying the scent would hold until the audience was over. Outside, the common people still lived without soap, but inside the palace, fragrance turned into ritual. Elizabeth herself became the high priestess of this aromatic kingdom. She was described as a woman who always carried a soft, graceful scent, floral, sweet, fresh, a scent that followed her through council meetings, royal banquets, and private audiences. Perfumes of her era were not refined glass bottles, but raw mixtures of crushed roses, dried lavender, strange medicinal herbs, ambergris from distant seas, musk traded across deserts, and, according to whispered rumors, even powdered tiger dung for strength and longevity of scent. Whether true or not, these stories only added to the mystique of a queen whose perfume was more feared than her temper. But the terrifying core of this story is not what she wore, it's what she felt. Elizabeth wasn't simply fond of good smells. She lived in a state where any unfamiliar odor was an enemy, any hint of sourness a threat. Historians now suspect she may have suffered from a mild form of osmophobia, a psychological sensitivity where certain scents trigger panic or revulsion. But in her time, no one dared name it. They only obeyed, because everyone understood that one misplaced whiff, one drop of sweat breaking through perfume at the wrong moment, could end a career faster than political scandal. And strangely, from this fear, an entire industry would eventually rise. Many of the earliest English perfumers, the ancestors of modern fragrance houses, began by serving Elizabeth's court, crafting scents strong enough to mask the natural odor of a 16th century castle. From the palace outward, the trend spread to noble houses, then towns, then cities. A new culture was born, a world where scent was status. We often think of power as something loud, a crown, an army, a decree. Yet in Elizabeth's story, power drifts like invisible smoke, carried on the breath of lavender or rose. And when you look back on her reign with that understanding, you realize something uncanny. She didn't rule just with intellect or policy, but with something unseen and ephemeral. She ruled with smell. And if you're ready to walk deeper into that world, where fragrance becomes a weapon and obsession becomes law, then tonight's journey is only beginning. The palace grows quieter as we move deeper into the story, the way a house settles into itself when night has fully claimed it. And in that hush, the truth about Elizabeth's strange dominion over scent begins to reveal itself with a softness that makes the whole thing even more unsettling. It was never just a rule, never just an eccentricity of a queen who wanted her court to smell pleasant. It was the invisible skeleton of her entire reign, the structure holding up every gesture, every ritual, every moment of contact between the monarch and the people who served her. In the pale morning light, when the first beams filtered through the narrow Tudor windows and caught the dust drifting lazily in the air, the servants already knew what kind of day they were facing, because they could read the queen's mood not from her voice or her expression, but from the intensity of the fragrance she ordered burned in her chambers. A sharper scent meant anxiety, a sweeter scent meant softness, and on the days when the smell was almost overwhelming, thick like syrup clinging to your throat, they knew not to breathe too deeply or make any sound at all. She hadn't spoken a word, yet the air itself had become an unspoken command. It's strange imagining a world where scent is language, but that is what the palace of Elizabeth I became, a place where people listened with their noses. The great halls that had once echoed with the stomp of boots and the laughter of huntsmen slowly transformed into a floating cloud of lavender dust, rosewater mist, and herbal steam rising from clothes warmed over scented braziers. You could walk down an entire corridor and guess exactly who had passed through a few minutes earlier, just from the faint trail left behind: a headmaid with her familiar rosemary and clove oil, a diplomat from France wearing heavy orange blossom, a guard who always overdid the musk and tried to hide how terrified he was of smelling like sweat beneath it. The palace became a maze of invisible signatures, where identifying someone required no sight at all. And the danger of leaving the wrong impression, literally the wrong smell, hovered over every interaction. The deeper you go into this world, the slower everything becomes. And that slowness is how fear thrives. People moved carefully so as not to disturb the layers of fragrance clinging to their garments, as though walking too quickly might cause the scent to evaporate. Even conversation softened, became gentler, quieter, airy, so no breath would carry anything impolite into the queen's presence. Those who worked close to her learned to take small breaths, shallow and controlled, so that their bodies remained cool and dry, never heating up enough to betray them with the faintest hint of human odor. And beneath all that restraint lay something tender but claustrophobic, the constant knowledge that one misstep, one misscent, might banish you from the center of power for the rest of your life. At night, when the palace candles burned low and the great rooms emptied, the servants had a different kind of ritual, one almost mournful. They would gather linens, gowns, gloves, cloaks, and undergarments worn by the queen and soak them in bowls of warm water infused with petals, crushed herbs, and oils so strong they stung the skin. The fabrics floated like ghostly shapes in the perfumed water, their movements slow and eerie, and the servants would gently turn them over, letting the floral steam rise into their faces. It wasn't just laundry, it was a way of refreshing the queen's aura itself. The scent she wore wasn't simply applied, it was cultured, maintained, reborn each morning after dissolving into the air the night before. Some nights, when the palace was especially still, a few servants swore they could feel the weight of her fear lingering in her clothes. They described it as a kind of tension woven into the threads, something you couldn't see but felt pressing lightly against your fingertips. It wasn't madness or superstition, it was the trace of a woman who lived with the unspoken terror that smell was a doorway through which sickness might slip. It was, perhaps, an echo of the child she had once been, wandering the corridors of a plague-haunted London, breathing in the scent of danger every time the wind shifted. That kind of memory doesn't let go easily, and in the palace it never let go at all. It wrapped around her like another layer of clothing, heavier even than velvet or brocade. The courtiers, caught in the orbit of her sensitivity, became performers in a scented theater. Each appearance before the queen required an invisible costume, not just what they wore, but how they smelled. They learned to prepare themselves like actors, anointing their wrists and necks with one fragrance, their gloves with another, their hair with something lighter to create a soft halo around them. Some spent half their income on imported aromatics just to maintain the illusion of purity. A few even hired personal scenters, the Tudor equivalent of private perfumers, who mixed small batches of custom oils tailored for the queen's preferences. And the more these rituals deepened, the more court life became a kind of slow-motion masquerade, where people did not hide behind masks, but behind carefully curated perfumes. Walking into the queen's presence was an experience of pure theater. First came the threshold, where the air suddenly felt thicker, warmer, fragrant in a way that almost forced you to breathe differently. Then the slow approach toward her, each step echoing softly against the polished floor, each heartbeat reminding you that she could reject you with a single sniff. When she looked up, those pale, intelligent eyes lifting toward you, the entire world seemed to pause. The queen didn't have to lean forward or lift her chin. She simply breathed. And in that breath, she judged you. People who survived those moments often describe them as a purification of the soul. Those who didn't rarely spoke of it at all. But for Elizabeth herself, these moments were more than ceremony. Each audience, each meeting, each greeting carried with it the same silent prayer. She whispered to herself, "Let nothing smell wrong." Because for her, smell was not just discomfort, it was omen. Her father, Henry VIII, died surrounded by infection. Her sister Mary suffered illnesses that filled her chambers with the odor of sickness. Tutors, advisors, distant relatives, many had fallen to plague, smallpox, or fever, each leaving behind the same sour breath that seeped into memory. Every life she lost had a scent. And so, as queen, she fought back the only way she knew, by controlling the air itself. In the evenings, when the court finally dissolved and she retreated to her private rooms, she often requested the doors be sealed tightly with cloth to prevent foreign smells from creeping in. Inside, she'd sit by the fire while her ladies refreshed the bowls of rose petals and sweet marjoram placed around the room. The flames flickered against the copper basins, releasing wisps of herbal perfume that curled upward toward the ceiling beams. And in that dim glow, with the murmur of the fire softening the corners of the room, Elizabeth could finally relax, if only slightly wrapped in the cocoon of fragrance she had built to protect herself. Yet even in moments of rest, her relationship with scent was complicated. It was comfort, but also armor. It calmed her, but reminded her of the world she feared. The stronger the scent, the more she felt in control, and the more she revealed her fear of what lay beyond it. It's almost heartbreaking, imagining her lying in bed surrounded by fragrant pillows, trying to keep at bay a world she believed was dangerous simply because it smelled alive. The courtiers, however, never saw this vulnerability. To them, the queen's scent rules were a show of power, a reminder that even the smallest detail of their existence could be judged. But beneath that cold authority lay a woman shaped by childhood, by loss, by the harshness of a world where survival depended on sensing danger early. Smell was her alarm system, her warning bell, her shield. And because she was queen, her shield became everyone else's burden. In the end, the palace did not just smell different because she willed it. It breathed differently. It moved, lived, and pulsed with her fear and her longing for purity. Everyone who entered adapted to her rhythm, slowed to her pace, and wrapped themselves in the same perfumed fog that had become her sanctuary. And as the days blended into years, that fog thickened until it became impossible to tell where the scent ended and the queen began. As though her very identity had dissolved into the air, she spent her life trying to purify. When you think about power, you rarely think about smell. Yet in the quiet corridors of Elizabeth's court, fragrance ruled everything, not just etiquette or hygiene, but behavior, emotion, ambition, and fear. It shaped every whispered conversation and every cautious step. It made the palace a world of soft rituals and slow movements, a place where silence carried meaning and scent carried judgment. And this world, built from vulnerability but enforced with authority, would linger long after she was gone, rising like perfume from the pages of history. The further you venture into Elizabeth's world, the more the air thickens, not with danger, not with noise, but with the slow, intoxicating haze of perfume that clings to every corner of her court, shaping people as surely as walls and ceilings shape a room. Part 3 is where the fragrance becomes fate, where bodies and identities dissolve into scented mist, and where the courtiers transform from individuals with ambitions into living vessels whose first duty is not loyalty, not intelligence, not bravery, but odorlessness. And the strangest part of all is how willingly they accepted that fate, as though their lives were threads woven into the same fragrant tapestry the queen used to wrap her fears. Each morning began long before dawn, because scent, in Elizabeth's court, was not something you applied, it was something you became. Servants woke the courtiers by gently knocking on their doors, slipping into their rooms with bowls of warm, perfumed water steaming like tiny clouds. There was no rushing, no splashing. Every movement had the tenderness of a ritual. The courtiers washed their faces and hands with the water first, letting the steam soften their skin, then dipped linen cloths into the bowl and pressed them delicately against their necks, wrists, and the back of their ears, the places closest to the queen's breath when one knelt before her. Even at this step, the fear was palpable. If the scent didn't cling properly, if the water cooled too quickly, if the mixture wasn't strong enough, the entire day might unravel before it even began. And then came the clothing, a slow rebirth draped in silk and fragrance. The garments they wore were not merely outfits, but scented containers. Cloaks steeped overnight in rosewater, doublets brushed with lavender powder, sleeves lined with sprigs of thyme hidden in tiny stitch pockets. Gloves soaked in oil until they exhaled sweetness with every gesture. Courtiers slid into these clothes as if climbing into second skins, skins built not to protect them from cold or wind, but from the queen's displeasure. They knew that she could forgive political missteps, could overlook minor insults, could even tolerate failure on the battlefield. But the one mistake she would never pardon was approaching her wrapped in the smell of ordinary human life. Walking through the corridors on such mornings was like entering a dreamscape crafted from mist and memory. The candles burned low, their flames leaning toward the slightest breeze, and in the wavering light, the fragrance floating through the palace took on a life of its own. It moved ahead of the courtiers like a herald, announcing them before they arrived. Some scents grew heavier near the council chambers, where nervous advisors paced behind doors, their stress mixing with the essential oils they'd rubbed onto their hands. Others drifted lightly across the gallery, where young nobles practiced their bows and curtsies with rehearsed grace, terrified of sweating through their perfumed layers. It was a world where you recognize people not by the sound of their footsteps, but by the hush of air stirred by the scents they carried. What makes all of this so haunting is the quietness with which it happened. No one spoke about the tyranny of smell aloud. Instead, they spoke in coded words and soft glances. "She's in a lavender mood today," someone might murmur, meaning Elizabeth was calm but wary. "Rosewater morning," whispered another, meaning the queen was relaxed enough to be approached. "Her scent is sharp today," was the warning everyone understood today would not be the day to make petitions or ask for favors. The queen's aroma became the barometer of the court, the invisible scoreboard dictating whose careers would rise or fall, and those careers rose and fell silently, not with dramatic accusations or courtroom trials, but with the deadly softness of exclusion. A courtier who failed the scent test would simply find himself no longer summoned, his letters unanswered, his presence unacknowledged, his footsteps no longer echoing beside those of the favored courtiers. Eventually he drifted away, swallowed by the anonymity of the outside world. No one dared ask why. Everyone already knew why. Yet amid this constant fear, certain courtiers turned the game of fragrance into power of their own. They became artists, sculptors of scent, using fragrance to construct identities far more alluring than their natural selves. These were the ones who mastered the delicate balance strong enough to mask their humanity, subtle enough not to overpower the queen's own perfume. They carefully blended oils from distant lands, traded secrets with travelers, bribed merchants for rare ingredients, and experimented with powders until they crafted personal signatures strong enough to be remembered. Some became so associated with their chosen aromas that people whispered their names with reverence, as though they were characters in a legend rather than people in a palace. Imagine a young nobleman drifting through the gallery, leaving a faint trail of crushed violets behind him that made the queen smile during her evening walk. Imagine a lady-in-waiting whose cinnamon and honey scent became so beloved by the queen that she was summoned more often than anyone else, gifted silk gowns and subtle praise. Imagine a foreign ambassador whose sandalwood fragrance soothed Elizabeth during political negotiations, earning him trust his nation had never enjoyed before. These people understood something profound in a world ruled by fear. Mastery of the queen's obsession became its own form of currency. But there were darker stories too, stories of courtiers undone by scent. One man supposedly fainted during an audience because his layers of perfume were so thick he couldn't breathe properly. A young maid once collapsed after scrubbing her arms raw, trying to remove the odor of the kitchens before attending her queen. Another woman, desperate to hide a minor infection causing her skin to smell sour, drowned herself in pungent oils so aggressively that Elizabeth expelled her from the chamber with a single, sharp inhale. These tales were whispered in corners, cautionary lessons wrapped in grief. Even the architecture of the palace changed with the queen's obsession. Windows were kept smaller to prevent unexpected drafts from pushing outside smells inside. Tapestries were beaten twice as often. Floors were scrubbed with herbal mixtures strong enough to sting the eyes. Rooms were rearranged according to how well they retained fragrance. Servants moved about with bowls of steaming herbs in their hands, leaving behind scented trails like ghostly offerings to an invisible god. And at the center of all this hovered Elizabeth, a woman who did not see her court as a political machine, but as a living organism that needed constant purifying. Her expectations shaped the very air people breathed, and each day she built her world anew, layering scents around herself like shields against memories she never spoke of. The courtiers, willingly or not, stepped into that world and breathed according to her rhythm. Yet beneath the beauty and strangeness lay a slow tragedy. The courtiers who worshipped scent lost pieces of themselves to the performance. They no longer smelled like who they were, the musk of riding horses at dawn, the salt of sweat after training, the faint sweetness of bread dough on the hands of someone fresh from the kitchens. Their natural signatures disappeared under the weight of lavender, rose, musk, and mint. They became more fragrance than flesh, shadows drifting through a perfume kingdom, and perhaps that was the point, in a place where sickness stalked through the streets outside, and where memories of plague lingered in every mind. Masking one's humanity became a form of survival. In that palace, where fear and power twisted together like strands of braided ribbon, the courtiers learned that the safest way to exist was to disappear beneath the scent of someone stronger. Elizabeth's fear had become their world. Their world had become her fragrance. And through that bond, fragile, scented, unseen court life slowed into a haunting dance of survival, where even the air felt alive with something ancient and trembling. The deeper we slip into her world, the more the palace reveals its true nature, not as a sanctuary of gold and velvet, but as a living body with arteries of stone, lungs of damp timber, and a scent that no amount of rosewater could completely smother. Beneath the chandeliers and the glittering banquets, beneath the chatter of nobles rehearsing their manners, lay the oldest truth of the 16th century, a truth Elizabeth felt with a kind of animal instinct every time she inhaled. Her palace was beautiful only to the eyes. To the nose, it was a battlefield. And the queen, with all her power, fought that battle every day of her life. Step softly across the floorboards and you would feel the faint give beneath your shoes, because moisture seeped up from the earth below, carrying the cold breath of mildew that clung to wood like an unwanted memory. In the lower corridors, where sunlight barely reached, the walls sweated, stones drank in rainwater, then released it slowly into the air, producing that sour dampness that settles into your throat and makes the room feel smaller than it is. These were the veins of the palace, narrow, dark pathways where servants hurried past with cloth pressed against their mouths, hoping not to inhale whatever might be growing in the unseen corners. And though the courtiers above floated through clouds of lavender and rose, the queen knew what lay beneath their feet, and that knowledge burned in her mind like a candle no draught could extinguish. There were rooms no perfume could conquer. The great kitchen, for instance, where boiling cauldrons filled the air with steam thick enough to sting the eyes, where cuts of meat hung from hooks and dripped onto the floor, where fish delivered late in the day quickly turned from fresh to foul under the heat. The scent of cooking was only pleasant in the dining hall. Here it was raw and overwhelming, mixing with sweat and smoke and the metallic tang of spilled broth. The servants who worked in those depths carried the smell on their clothes even hours after leaving, a reminder the queen could detect instantly if they passed too close. Some were dismissed forever after a single unfortunate whiff. Then there were the privies, small chambers tucked into corners of the palace like unpleasant secrets. They were cleaned as often as possible, but as often as possible in the 16th century meant something very different from what we understand today. Waste dropped into pits below, pits that were emptied only when they grew too full to ignore. Until then, the smell seeped upward like a curse, curling along the floor, slipping beneath doors, clinging to the hems of gowns. On warm days it became unbearable. On cold days it sank deeper, settling into stone that had already absorbed centuries of use. Elizabeth could sense these things the way a musician senses tuning. Her nostrils flared at the slightest hint. Her body stiffened, and everyone around her immediately understood they needed to fix it or vanish. Outside the palace walls, things were worse: a world without plumbing, without sewers, without the faintest comprehension of hygiene. Streets soaked in rainwater mixed with filth. Buckets of waste flung from windows with a shout. Rats bold enough to run in daylight. The people approached the palace gates carrying the scent of their world with them, a world the queen feared more than any army. Guards were trained not just to inspect clothing and weapons, but to watch for signs of dirtiness, for the sheen of sweat, for the telltale sourness of someone who had walked too far or slept too little. A man with the wrong scent did not even make it past the second courtyard. That was not cruelty in her mind, it was survival. And yet, the palace itself betrayed her constantly. When humidity rose, perfume became heavier, cloying, almost sickening. When winter wind blew through cracks in the walls, it carried with it the scent of outside smoke, damp wool, mud. Elizabeth learned to recognize these shifts with the precision of a priest reading omens. She could step into a room and know immediately whether someone had walked through earlier who didn't belong. She could tell when the firewood was too old, when the candles had burned too long, when the servants had used too much vinegar to scrub the floors. Her world narrowed into something invisible. Others saw walls and tapestries. She sensed molecules floating in the air. Nights were the hardest. Darkness magnified every smell, made it more intimate, more intrusive. The queen often slept with small bowls of petals placed under her pillow, not as luxury, but as protection. The faint sweetness allowed her to breathe without feeling suffocated by the stale scent of nighttime chambers. Her ladies-in-waiting moved quietly around her, checking fabrics, burning herbs, closing windows at the slightest draft. The palace slept, but Elizabeth rarely did, her senses too alert, too trained by years of survival. Many nights she woke suddenly, convinced she had smelled something wrong, something unfamiliar. The attendants would rush to her side, lighting candles, checking walls, clearing the air with gentle fans. Most queens feared assassins. Elizabeth feared infection drifting through keyholes. And though no one dared mention it aloud, the courtiers knew the palace was failing her. Stone can only absorb so much. Wood can only dry so far. Even the strongest perfume cannot mask damp rot beneath it forever. The architects tried repairs. The servants scrubbed until their hands cracked. The perfumers mixed stronger concoctions. But they were fighting nature itself, and nature has no mercy for royalty. Still, Elizabeth never abandoned the battle. She crossed rooms with the posture of a woman who refused to surrender to her surroundings. She sat on her throne as if the air itself obeyed her command, and maybe it did because the court shaped itself to her fears. People walked softer, breathed lighter, cleaned more, scented more, prayed more. The palace became a creature trained to hold its breath for her. Yet for all her efforts, she could not escape the truth tucked into every stone around her. She lived in a gilded world that was decaying in slow motion. A world that smelled like both power and peril. A world where, no matter how much she perfumed it, the undercurrent of rot remained a reminder that even queens cannot outrun the century they are born into. It is in that tension between beauty and decay, between perfume and stench, between control and helplessness, that the story of her reign truly breathes. And as the scent thickens around her, her fear begins to take shape, becoming something larger than preference and sharper than disgust. Something that rules not only the palace but the hearts of everyone who served within its scented walls. The palace grows even quieter as we slip into the next layer of her world. The layer scented not by flowers or oils, but by something far more deliberate, far more crafted, a realm where fragrance itself becomes architecture, identity, and weapon. This is where Elizabeth's obsession stops being reaction and becomes design, where she no longer shields herself from the world, but begins shaping the world to match the scent she needs it to be. And in that shift, the story turns from fear into power, from survival into creation. Because the perfumes of her era were not neat little glass bottles on dressing tables, but strange alchemical mixtures born from desperation, superstition, trade routes, and the need to prove one's purity in a world collapsing under its own filth. Imagine, in your mind, the Queen's private chamber late in the afternoon, sunlight slanting through leaded windows, dust floating lazily in golden beams, the room warm with the glow of a low fire. On the nearest table sits a collection of objects that look almost ritualistic: tiny carved boxes, metal spoons shaped like shells, silk-wrapped bundles of herbs, and stoppered bottles holding liquids so dark they look like drops of night trapped in glass. Here is where the palace's true work begins. Because every morning's fragrance starts as an experiment the night before, a slow brewing of nature and intention. Court apothecaries and perfumers, men who were more chemists than servant, would grind petals by hand, pound resins with stone, boil roots until they surrendered their oils, then mix them with wine or vinegar or even spirituous liquors smuggled from far ports. The recipes were always changing, always adjusting to the Queen's mood, the season, the state of the air. There was no science yet to guide them, only instinct and inherited wisdom. So they practiced by scent alone, leaning over bowls of crushed rose, testing the sharpness of lavender by pressing it between their fingers, comparing one drop of ambergris to another by watching how it clung to the surface of warm water. These men were craftsmen of the invisible, working with substances that evaporated, shifted, faded, and transformed the moment they touched skin. And perhaps that was why Elizabeth respected them more than most other servants. They dealt in the same currency she did scent as truth. Scent as memory, scent as shield. But perfumes of the 16th century were not merely flowers and herbs. They were built from the oddest, darkest ingredients the world could offer. Long before modern sensibilities, the boundary between beauty and repulsion was far thinner. Perfume makers used musk scraped from the gland of deer, civet extracted from small nocturnal animals, and ambergris, a waxy substance that formed in the bellies of whales, expelled into the sea, then washed ashore strangely fragrant after months of drifting. These materials were precious not only because they were rare, but because they lingered, binding lighter scents together, giving perfume its staying power in a world that had no deodorant, no soap, and no running water. Rumors even circulated whispered with a mix of fascination and disgust that certain concoctions included dried animal dung, especially from powerful creatures like tigers, because people believed it strengthened the mixture, made it alive in a way that clung to skin for days. Elizabeth knew all of this. She didn't just wear the scents, she understood their purpose, their weight, their symbolism. In a palace where every surface held a trace of decay, it wasn't enough to mask the air. She needed fragrances with longevity, stamina, endurance. Perfume was her armor, and she wore it with the same intention a knight wore steel. The sharp notes warned danger. The soft notes invited alliances. The sweetness declared dominance without aggression. And to anyone entering her presence, the message was unmistakable. She smelled like control. As the queen's fascination intensified, the palace staff developed intricate ritualistic systems to maintain the olfactory world she demanded. The perfumers became almost priestly figures, carrying recipes in their heads like sacred texts. They heated oils before presenting them to the queen so that the scent rose quickly and filled the chamber. They steeped cloth in mixtures overnight, then wrung them out by hand, feeling for just the right saturation. They rubbed the queen's gloves with fragrant powders, then pressed them gently between warm stones to help the aroma bloom. Even her shoes were treated, lined with herbs that released scent as she walked, creating a trail behind her like smoke trailing a torch. But beneath the artistry lay a deeper truth, one that no one dared speak in her presence. Perfume was also a political tool. Elizabeth understood the symbolic power of smelling clean, sweet, controlled, and immaculate in a time when most of Europe smelled like fear and dirt and disease. Her fragrance became a message to foreign ambassadors. England was refined. England was strong. England was different. And she, the woman who embodied the kingdom, was untouched by the chaos outside her walls. Her courtiers, of course, saw this transformation and tried to imitate it. But they could never achieve the same effect, because they lacked her understanding of scent as strategy. They wore fragrance like decoration. She wore it like prophecy. She believed deeply, almost superstitiously, that certain scents protected her from illness. Sweet marjoram soothed her chest. Rosemary cleared her breath. Myrtle eased her anxieties. Orris root calmed her nerves. She built her survival around these beliefs, surrounding herself with bowls of petals, sachets of herbs, and pomanders she held close during public appearances. Sometimes, in moments of privacy, she pressed a pomander to her nose as though it were a lifeline, breathing in deeply as if drawing strength from it. The gesture was small enough to be hidden behind a fan or sleeve, but those closest to her recognized it instantly, the queen's private ritual of reassurance. She could hold her throne steady. She could hold her image together. She could hold her fear at bay. All she needed was the right scent. What she didn't realize, or perhaps realized but refused to acknowledge, was that the more she relied on fragrance, the more the palace itself became addicted to it. Rooms felt wrong without it. Clothes felt unfinished. Air felt thin. People felt naked without their oils and waters. And in this slow, creeping dependence, fragrance transcended its physical form and became something psychological, something that shaped how people moved, breathed, interacted, and even thought. A courtier without scent was like a soldier without armor, unprepared, unworthy, vulnerable. Yet the most haunting aspect of this transformation was how it blurred the line between mask and identity. Elizabeth's scent was no longer just a smell, it became her essence. Courtiers recognized her presence before hearing her footsteps. Ambassadors described her in letters not only by appearance or manner, but by fragrance. Some compared her scent to summer gardens, others to exotic spices. One wrote that she smelled like the memory of something lost yet comforting, a description almost poetic in its strangeness. In a way, her fragrance outlived her. After her passing, people claimed to sense her presence in certain rooms long after her body had left them, as though the walls themselves had memorized her smell. Whether true or not, the belief shows how deeply scent had woven itself into her identity, how it had become the invisible shadow of her reign. And so, in this stage of her story, the perfumes crafted in copper bowls and ground with stone mortars were no longer mere luxuries. They were symbols, shields, lifelines. They were the queen's way of bending the world to her will, of asserting dominance over a century she feared would swallow her whole. They allowed her to turn vulnerability into power, fear into ritual, fragility into legacy. The palace still decayed around her. The world still stank of plague and poverty. But within her scented sphere, she felt safe, or at least safer than she would have felt breathing the raw air of reality. And so the fragrances deepened, intensified, became more elaborate, as if each new mixture were one more brick reinforcing the wall she built between herself and everything she could not control. But walls like that never stay unchallenged for long, and behind the queen's scented armor, something darker was beginning to stir. The deeper this story breathes, the more you begin to feel how scent was no longer a preference nor a ritual, nor even a shield, but a law, an unspoken code woven into the walls of the palace, into the fabric of every gown, into the pulse of every person who dared to step within reach of the queen's breath. By this point in her reign, the fragrance that once wrapped Elizabeth like comfort had hardened into something sharper, almost judicial. It judged others before she spoke. It filtered the world for her. It decided who could enter and who must remain outside. And from that quiet, fragrant throne of power emerged a decree more absolute than any statute written on parchment. Only those without scent, without the wrong scent, could approach her. The rule was never carved into wood, never announced in public assemblies, never even officially recorded. It did not need to be. A law enforced by fear is always obeyed more faithfully than one written in ink. The courtiers understood the queen's limits intimately, the way a child understands the weather by instinct, by tension, by the shift in the air when a storm is coming. They felt the warning long before she spoke. A slight flinch in her nose, a narrowing of her eyes, a hand raised not to dismiss someone, but to distance herself from them. These were the signals that could end a career in seconds. And so the palace adapted. The corridors became checkpoints of purity. Servants waiting outside the queen's chambers didn't merely check clothing for dust or ensure garments were orderly. They sniffed, gently, discreetly, but with terror in their bones. They leaned in close to courtiers, pretending to straighten a collar or adjust a sleeve, while secretly inhaling near the neckline, searching for the faintest betrayal of human odor. More than once, a nobleman dressed in jewels and silk was quietly turned away, ushered down an alternative hallway by a servant who dared not embarrass him publicly, but knew he could not be allowed near the queen. Those silent redirections became infamous. Everyone knew what they meant. The shame clung to a person long after the scent had faded. And yet, the law of scent was not simple. It wasn't only the absence of bad odor that mattered. It was the presence of the right one, the one that blended with the queen's atmosphere without intruding, too subtle, and the queen might believe you had neglected her sensibilities. Too strong, and she might think you were attempting to mask some hidden impurity. The courtiers walked a knife's edge, balancing perfumes the way diplomats balanced alliances. They rehearsed their fragrance like dancers rehearse steps, practicing not movement, but stillness, not speech, but breath. The closer one came to the queen's chamber, the more the air filled with a strange mingling of fear and sweetness. The queen's ladies-in-waiting bore the heaviest burden. Their proximity to Elizabeth meant they had to maintain a level of cleanliness and fragrance that bordered on the inhuman. They bathed more often than anyone else of the era, not in full immersion as we would imagine, but in repeated sponging, rinsing, perfuming, and changing of linens. Their hands were constantly scented, their sleeves lightly dusted, their hair brushed with oils until it shone. They slept surrounded by herbs to keep their bodies fresh, even during rest. Sometimes they woke in the middle of the night to reapply scent, terrified that one moment of negligence might reveal itself at dawn. There were stories whispered among them, stories told only in the dim glow of candles when exhaustion made their tongues loose. One lady confessed that she no longer smelled anything at all. The constant aroma had numbed her senses. Another said her skin had become irritated, raw from the oils that she rubbed on herself day after day. A third admitted she sometimes dreamed of the scent of plain, clean air and impossible luxury in their world. They loved their queen, feared their queen, served their queen, but they were becoming creatures who no longer recognized their own natural scent. Their identities were dissolving into foreign fragrances. And in the center of all this stood Elizabeth, a woman both aware of her rule and imprisoned by it. She felt the pressure too, not guilt, nor remorse, but the weight of vigilance. She had created a court where smell meant survival. That law applied to her as strictly as it did to the courtiers. When she awoke, before she even opened her eyes, attendants refreshed the room so she would not breathe the stale air of sleep. When she stepped into a hallway, a servant walked ahead with a hidden sachet of herbs to clear the path. If she traveled, carts of scented materials followed behind like an army. If she visited a noble's estate, the household would spend weeks preparing, scrubbing every corner, perfuming every tapestry, soaking floors in herbal water with the hope that it would please her. People feared hosting her not because she was unkind, but because she was impossible to satisfy. And yet, she was not cruel. Her rules were born from fear, not arrogance. She did not punish people for their scent. She withdrew. She did not exile anyone publicly. She simply would not let them approach. Her silence was the sentence. Her distance was the punishment. And her subtle shift in posture, the way she leaned back ever so slightly, the way she angled her head could crush a man's future without a word. Her court learned to read her the way sailors read the stars, because scent was not just a preference. It was the axis around which her world spun. As the years passed, the scent rituals grew even heavier. People began carrying pomanders, small metal spheres filled with herbs, not for their own comfort, but to avoid offending her when passing by. Some even held them to their lips as they approached, inhaling to mask their own breath. Meetings shortened, dinners grew quieter, ceremonies unfolded with stillness, as though everyone feared any movement that might stir up the wrong odor. But even more telling was how court politics transformed. Alliances were now formed around scent. A perfumer favored by the queen became more powerful than a noble with a great estate. A courtier who discovered a fragrance Elizabeth liked could find himself promoted within weeks. The economy of England shifted subtly as trade in herbs, oils, and exotic resins flourished. Ships sailed farther. Merchants earned fortunes. And through it all, Elizabeth stood at the center, her fear creating opportunity, shaping markets, changing the very fabric of English life. And yet, something darker lurked beneath this scented world, a truth that no perfumer could mask. The Queen's relationship with smell was not just precaution, it was obsession. It consumed her days, shaped her nights, dictated her behavior, defined her rule. She could not escape it, because the world outside her scented bubble remained exactly what she feared: dirty, unpredictable, scented with decay. Those who watched her closely saw moments of flicker flashes of vulnerability, when a shift in the wind brought an unwelcome smell, or when illness in the palace stirred her memory of losses long buried. In those moments, her composure cracked, her breathing tightened, and she reached instinctively for fragrance as a drowning person reaches for air. Her rule of scent was not a tyranny, it was a plea, a cry wrapped in rose petals and lavender powder. A queen trying to hold on to control in a world that smelled like death. And though her courtiers bowed to her rules, they could not save her from the deeper truth beginning to spread through the palace, a truth that would one day overshadow even her perfumes. The air inside the palace grows emotionally heavier as we drift into the next layer of her story, the layer where fear stops hiding beneath perfume and begins whispering through the cracks of Elizabeth's composure. By now, the queen had built an entire kingdom around scent, a world where fragrance dictated proximity, ritual shaped behavior, and the wrong smell could erase a person's future. But beneath all these layers of rose water and crushed herbs lay something far more fragile, far more human, a quiet terror threading through her every breath. And part 7 moves gently, almost sorrowfully, into that hidden chamber of the queen's heart, the place where her obsession no longer protects her, but begins to unravel her. Those who live closest to her sensed this shift long before the rest of the court. They noticed how she started to pause at doorways longer than before, as though silently testing the air before entering. They watched how she held her breath in small ways, not visibly, but with a tightness around her ribs that only those who dressed her each morning could see. At first they thought it was age, or exhaustion, or the weight of politics, but gradually they realized it was something deeper. Elizabeth was listening for danger, not with her ears but with her nose. It wasn't danger in the dramatic sense, no assassins lurking behind tapestries, no poisoned chalices waiting on banquet tables, but something subtler, something rooted in the memory of sickness that had shaped her childhood. She remembered the smell of fever when it entered a room before anyone else sensed it. She remembered the sour breath of plague victims. She remembered how illness carried a scent long before symptoms appeared. And in her mind, scent became the earliest warning of betrayal, not of people, but of fate. Thus she watched for it constantly. Her attendants were the first to notice these moments when her fear surfaced. They were small, delicate moments, fleeting but unmistakable. A sudden stiffness in her shoulders when a servant passed too close, a tremor in her voice when she sensed the air change, a shock of coldness in her eyes when she inhaled something unexpected. Even the slightest shift of perfume applied too late, a corridor not aired properly, a tapestry not beaten hard enough could send a ripple of unease through her body. She never spoke of it. She didn't need to. The silence itself became her confession. Those moments of fear traveled outward, influencing the entire palace. Conversations grew shorter, breaths gentler, movements slower. People walked on the edges of hallways, avoiding disturbing the air. Doors were opened more cautiously. Tapestries were brushed aside as though they might exhale something harmful. The court, once a dizzying spectacle of ambition, slowly turned into a hushed stage of restraint, as though everyone had entered a chapel where scent, not prayer, held the power to summon or destroy. But behind all these behaviors was an even more heartbreaking truth. Elizabeth feared her own body as much as she feared others. She worried her breath might betray her after a night of poor sleep. She worried her skin might reveal tension or illness. She worried the scent of age, that inevitable, subtle shift in the chemistry of a person's skin, might signal weakness to those eager to challenge her authority. And so she bathed not only to smell pleasant, but to erase any trace of herself that time might leave behind. Her ladies, who adored her despite the weight of her demands, saw how this fear deepened at night. The chambers were always filled with bowls of petals, but now additional herbs were added time. Bay leaf, wormwood, and mint plants believed to ward off sickness. They burned rosemary on low coals, letting the smoke swirl like whispers around the queen's bed. They refreshed her linens twice, sometimes 3 times in a single night. The windows were shut tightly, not to keep out the cold, but to keep out the scent of the outside world. And even then, she sometimes woke in panic, her eyes opened suddenly, searching the darkness as though a threat had stepped into the room. The ladies would rush to her side, and she would lie perfectly still, breathing carefully, waiting for the air to settle again. Only after inhaling the familiar perfume, she trusted rose, myrtle. Lavender would she close her eyes, her fear dissolving into weary acceptance. These incidents were never spoken of in the daylight. They existed only in the hush of shared glances between tired attendants, in the faint tremor in a lady's hand as she prepared the morning's perfumes. In the quiet way, servants avoided discussing the queen's anxiety. To speak of it was to give it shape. To give it shape was to make it real. And no one in the palace wanted that. They loved her too much, feared her too deeply, depended on her too entirely. But despite the silence, something else had begun to happen within the palace, a slow shift in the courtiers' interpretation of the queen's obsession. Some believed she possessed an otherworldly sensitivity, a gift that allowed her to detect sickness before any physician could. Others whispered that her fear was a shadow from childhood, an echo of traumas too deep for any queen to escape. A few even thought she battled demons within herself, not supernatural ones, but the ghosts of memories tied to scent, memories of blood, of fever, of loneliness, of nights listening to people cough behind closed doors. The truth lay somewhere between all these guesses. She was not mad. She was not weak. She was a woman who had lived too long with the scent of danger wrapped around her. A woman whose life had been touched by death too many times. A woman who used fragrance not to impress, but to breathe. And in the palace, where silence now ruled as strongly as perfume, everyone adapted to her private storm. The courtiers learned to anticipate her moods by smell. The servants learned to read the air the way one reads weather. The palace itself seemed to breathe with her, contracting when she grew anxious, expanding when she relaxed, always shifting subtly in response to the queen who ruled not by sword nor by law, but by scent. Yet beneath all the layers of protection she built, one truth lingered stubbornly at the edge of her consciousness. No fragrance, no ritual, no barrier of herbs could truly keep the world at bay forever. Fear, once invited, becomes a companion, and hers was beginning to whisper louder. The palace held its breath as the queen moved deeper into the later years of her reign, and the rituals surrounding scent, which once felt like private defenses, began shaping the entire rhythm of political life in ways no one could ignore anymore. The courtiers had adjusted, the servants had surrendered, and the perfumers had risen to quiet power. But in the shadowed corners of the palace, a stranger truth was taking form, the realization that fragrance had become not only Elizabeth's shield, but the oxygen her dynasty breathed. Every alliance, every negotiation, every private audience unfolded inside her carefully curated atmosphere, and those who wished to remain in her favor had to understand this invisible language she used as fluently as she did. It was in this scented world that foreign ambassadors held their breath before speaking, where council meetings were conducted in rooms saturated with herbal smoke, and where rival nobles tried to decipher the queen's moods from the faintest shift in her perfume. As England grew more powerful abroad, the heart of that power remained anchored to an age-old fear the queen never named aloud, a fear that the outside world with its sickness, its dirt, its stench might seep into her palace and into her life if she let her guard drop even for a moment. In private, this fear deepened into habit. Elizabeth began insisting on heavier purification rituals before major decisions. Before signing a treaty or responding to diplomatic threats, she retreated into a chamber where bowls of steaming herbs filled the air until the windows fogged with moisture. She breathed in rosemary and mint to sharpen her mind, sweet marjoram to steady her nerves, and lavender to cleanse what she called the air of chaos. Her advisors waited in the outer hallways, speaking in whispers, their footsteps softened by thick carpets perfumed overnight. They knew better than to interrupt her in these moments, for she regarded scent as a form of clarity, as though the right fragrance could sweep away confusion and reveal the path forward. And though none of them truly understood her ritual, they respected it, because time and again, England's fate emerged from those scented chambers stronger than before. But the deeper truth, the one the queen felt but never admitted, was that her world was narrowing. What once had been a shield was becoming a boundary. The palace, with all its jeweled halls and triumphant banners, had begun to feel like a gilded cage scented with rose and fear. Elizabeth kept the windows closed more often. She shortened her public appearances. She avoided crowded gatherings unless absolutely necessary. Even in her gardens, where fresh air should have comforted her, she found herself recoiling when the wind carried foreign smells from the city, smoke from chimneys, sweat from laborers, damp leaves from the riverbanks. Every unfamiliar scent felt like a threat. Every shift in the breeze felt like a warning. This subtle withdrawal did not go unnoticed by those who loved her. But none dared question her, for how do you confront a fear that has shaped a woman's entire life? Her ladies saw the quiet unraveling first. They noticed when she paused longer before stepping into a room, as though sensing something the rest of them could not detect. They watched her fingers tremble faintly when she held a pomander too tightly. They heard the rare cracks in her voice when she asked, for the third or fourth time in a single evening, whether the herbs in her chamber had been replaced. And though they whispered among themselves in the safety of candlelit corners, their whispers held no judgment, only sadness. They understood that their queen, who had conquered armies and silenced conspirators, could not conquer the phantom she smelled in the air, the scent of mortality. Yet even as her inner world grew smaller, the outer world continued to bend to her rules. England's nobility adopted the Queen's obsession as fashion. Wealthy households began perfuming their halls not just in her honor, but out of genuine admiration for the trend she created. Merchants imported rare ingredients, frankincense, jasmine, damask rose, and their fortunes swelled. Apothecaries began blending scents professionally, their shops becoming early predecessors of the perfume houses that would one day dominate Europe. What had begun as a queen's personal fear had become a cultural revolution, one that elevated cleanliness and fragrance from luxuries to symbols of refinement. But even this triumph, this subtle rewriting of England's identity, could not keep Elizabeth's own fears from tightening around her like a scented veil she could no longer remove. As the queen aged, scent became her last anchor against the truth she avoided that time was carving lines into her once smooth skin, that her body was changing in ways she could not fully control, that death was drawing nearer with every passing season. She clung to fragrance as though clinging to youth, surrounding herself with familiar scents that reminded her of power, beauty, and the illusion of permanence. Her attendants often found her lingering beside bowls of petals long after the petals had wilted. Sometimes she would take a piece of silk perfumed with oils and hold it against her face, closing her eyes, breathing slowly, as though scent alone could suspend the march of time. And in those moments, the palace grew silent, as though every stone understood the fragility of its queen. Yet even as age crept quietly upon her, Elizabeth refused to let the world see defeat. She stepped into council chambers with her spine straight, her face painted, her hair adorned, her fragrance perfectly arranged, a wall of scent that declared she was still sovereign, still untouchable, still the woman who had lifted England from uncertainty into an era of strength. But beneath the perfume, beneath the velvet and jewels, she carried the same truth every mortal carries: fear of the end. And scent, which had once made her feel invincible, now served only to remind her how much she depended on it to hold herself together. The palace, for all its rituals and discipline, could no longer protect her from the slow approach of fate. Illness whispered through the corridors during winters, carried by drafts no amount of herbs could fully block. Servants grew sick, courtiers vanished for weeks, and physicians moved with increasing caution. The queen insisted she could smell illness before anyone else, and though her attendants nodded respectfully, they also knew that years of obsession had sharpened her imagination as much as her senses. Some nights, she woke suddenly, convinced she had breathed in something dangerous. Her ladies reassured her, calmed her, replaced her linens once more. But the fear remained. It lingered like a shadow behind her perfume, a note she could never fully erase. And this is where her story begins to dim gently into part 9, where fragrance no longer represents glamour or power or protection, but memory, the memory of what she once was, the memory of youth fading like a scent on the wind. Part 9 drifts into the final chapter of her scented reign, where perfume becomes not shield, but echo, and the queen, surrounded by all the ritual she built, must finally face the truth her fragrances can no longer conceal. As the final act unfolds, the palace grows quieter than ever. As though even the walls sense the shift, the queen, who once commanded the air itself, now walks through her chambers more slowly. With a softness that unsettles those who have served her since youth, the fragrances that once defined her presence now seem heavier, more nostalgic, clinging to her clothes like memories instead of armor. Her ladies-in-waiting notice the change. First, she requests gentler scents, softer herbs, lighter infusions of rose and lavender, as if the sharper notes now overwhelm her. They comply, of course, not speaking aloud what they all suspect her senses, once so sharp they bordered on supernatural, have begun to dim with age. The world that once pressed too strongly against her nose now drifts past her more quietly, and this quietness frightens her more than any foul odor ever did. She begins spending more time alone, sitting before the window she once kept tightly shut, watching the sky change colors as afternoon slips into dusk. Her hand often rests on a pomander, but she no longer lifts it to her face. Instead, her fingers circle its metal seams absent-mindedly, tracing patterns she has known for decades. She does not speak of it, but her heart aches with a truth she cannot admit. The world is beginning to smell the same to her, as though life itself is flattening into a single muted scent. Her fear has not vanished. Fear never vanishes, but it has changed shape, becoming a quiet companion instead of an enemy. And that, in its way, is even more unsettling. The palace, sensing her vulnerability, shifts into a hush. The courtiers walk slower. The servants close doors more gently. Conversations soften like fading perfume. Even the musicians in the gallery play more quietly, their notes drifting through the air like pale ribbons. Everyone feels the same truth settling across the kingdom. The queen's world, built so carefully over decades, is beginning to unravel at the edges. But the unraveling is not violent. It is tender, melancholic, like the slow end of a long burning candle. Elizabeth's ladies notice she lingers in her chambers longer each evening, sitting by the fire while the scent of warm herbs curls around her. She asks them to recount stories from years past, victories, celebrations, triumphs, and as they speak, she inhales deeply, not because of the herbs, but because each story carries a phantom scent of what once was. She remembers the smell of her childhood garden, the lavender fields she walked through in youth, the fragrance of the books she loved, the scent of her mother's last letter, the sweet aroma of her coronation day. These memories rise from the recesses of her mind like perfume released from crushed petals, soft and fleeting but powerful enough to bring tears to her eyes. Her obsession, once a shield against the world, becomes a doorway back into her own life. Fragrance, which she used to control others, now becomes a mirror reflecting everything she cannot control: time, memory, mortality. And in these quiet evenings, wrapped in the glow of firelight, she begins letting go. Not dramatically, not with despair, but with the gentle acceptance of someone who has built her identity so carefully that she knows which parts must be released and which parts will live on beyond her. The last months of her reign unfold in chambers that smell of soft florals rather than sharp herbal mixtures. She asks for fresh linens more often, not out of fear, but comfort. She walks through her gardens with slower steps, her fingers brushing the tops of flowers as though greeting old friends. And perhaps the most heartbreaking change of all, she allows the windows to be opened. The outside air, once her greatest threat, now drifts inside freely, carrying scents of damp earth, wood smoke, distant rain. She breathes them in without flinching. The fear that once commanded her every decision now loosens its grip, replaced by a strange serenity. Those around her sense it. The palace, once ruled by scent, now feels lighter. The courtiers no longer tremble as they approach her, and the servants feel no need to perfume every corner. Rituals dissolve into gentler habits. The queen, who shaped the air around her for decades, now lets the air shape itself. And when the end finally approaches, it does not come with the sharpness she always dreaded. It arrives softly, like the faintest trace of lavender on a pillowcase. Her ladies sit beside her as she rests, the fire crackling gently, bowls of rose petals placed around the room, not to protect her, but to honor her. She breathes slowly, each inhale carrying the scent of a life lived in defiance of a world that once felt too dangerous to touch. And as her eyes close for the final time, her attendants swear the room fills with a fragrance unlike any they've ever known. Not rose, not lavender, not herbs or oils, but something warm, subtle, and impossibly peaceful. Perhaps it was the scent of a fear that finally let go. Perhaps it was the scent of a queen whose world, built upon fragrance and shaped by memory, had finally found its rest. Either way, it lingered long after she was gone,